some folks who had, I guess, a bad viewpoint of the court. And so they did this big national study, and fairness was the big thing. People want to be treated fairly. And then consistency, having there be consistency. Again, if we're in a program and I treat you differently than you, and y'all have exactly the same behaviors, is that fair? That actually goes back to also, I always think fairness, but again, we want consistency. We want to be able to have that in the program. And those are things we can plan for. I mean, for example, consistency. If you're giving incidents and sanctions, just kind of do some very basic things. If you're giving incidents and sanctions, do you have, for example, a grid of ones that you give? So, when I come into your program, if I'm going to face a sanction, maybe you don't have an exact grid where you can say, if I do something on this date and I do this thing, they match up here. But is there a list of things that I know could be expected to face? And my defense attorney can say, hey, you come into the drug court, you do something, these are the rules, you don't follow the rules, one of these things might happen to you. And if you kind of look at the list, and this list here gets progressively worse. So it could be any of these things, and you have an understanding of what those things are. So that there's that expectation there. Let's go on. So we talked about what this is based on. We have a fact sheet on behavior modification. If there aren't copies of it out here in the atrium, you can download it for free. So you just go to ndci.org. If you go to ndci.org, which is the National Drug Court Institute.org, and you can go to NADCP to access it. And you click on that, what you'll see feathered up is it comes publications. You click on publications, and you'll actually see fact sheets. And if you go down to fact sheets, this is there, and you can click on it and download the PDF, and it's free. I mean, it takes you online. I've done it for folks when I was able to come go online during the presentation, and it takes all about 25 seconds, and it's on my computer. So we're going to talk about both incentives and sanctions and therapeutic adjustments. If all of y'all were in the lunch conversation that we just had, all those things were talked about. It was actually a whole question around the therapeutic adjustments because the question is centered around someone's relapse. And then what would be the difference? And y'all heard the whole conversation. Carolyn talked a good bit about it, a couple other folks in the panel, about the differences in therapeutic adjustments, which is what you would do. For example, if I test positive in your program, and y'all have all seen this or experienced this, and you're fairly new to drug court, so you will see it in experience. Oftentimes, if someone tests positive, there's going to be other things that they did that the court has to respond to at the same time. Because it's likely if I go out and use, and I don't come in and tell you ahead of time. So I'm not coming in to alert you like I think Phil in that session gave the example of the one young lady who immediately went and called her sponsor and kind of put everything into place. I'd already called her case manager. The court already knew about the lapse long before she even came to court. So that's a certain circumstance. But otherwise, if I just test positive and you don't know about it and I'm lying to you, it's also quite possible that I've done other things that the court's going to have to respond to at the same time. I was supposed to, let's just start. I was supposed to make 3 drug drops this week. Dropped 1, tested positive. Missed the 2 others because I was sick. I was supposed to go to 3 groups. I only attended 2, and I was late to one of those. I was supposed to meet with my case manager, and I didn't. Any variety of those things. I didn't come to court. I was late for court, whatever it might be. And so the court's not only having to respond to the drug use, they're having to respond to behavior issues as well. So, if you're going to punish somebody, or I'm going to punish somebody, I can either give you something or I can take away something, right? I can give you a sanction or I can take away something that you believe is a benefit. So that's one way to kind of open your mind up about different ways of sanctioning folks. And for those of you who are new in drug court, one thing that we think about from the criminal justice point of view, I think oftentimes is when we think about sanctions, is we immediately go to jail. We're going to talk about during this presentation that in a drug court setting, you want to not do that. You don't want to go to jail as your initial incentives, your initial sanctions, because when you do that, if that's really the most that you got, right? There's really not much you can do to someone more than jail as far as a sanction. So if you immediately go to jail, how do you up that? If they continue to do something bad, it's hard to have, because we know from the literature, we're going to talk about it, is to have progressive sanctions. You want your sanctions to be progressive, so you don't want to start with jail. If jail's what you've got is your main sanction, is not your main sanction, your most onerous sanction. So incentives, you can give positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Sanctions, you can give punishment or response calls and therapeutic adjustments. If it's okay with y'all, I hate this terminology because it's scientific jargony, and to me, no one's almost ever in your court going to be talking. Y'all aren't going to sit around the table talking about negative reinforcement and response calls. Now, if you are, let me know. So what I'm going to do through the presentation is I'm going to talk about when we go more things like this and concrete stuff, if that's fair. If y'all want to read about response calls, y'all can again download that fact sheet and then read it and then go to the best practice standards and read the whole standards on incentives and sanctions, which you need to do anyway. You can also go to the bench book. For those of you who are judges, we have a bench book for judges, and there's a whole chapter on incentives and sanctions, and you can read to your heart's content on all this stuff. But since we have a fairly limited time period today, I want to talk about nuts and bolts, things you do. So, positive reinforcement, but rather than talk about words, what can we do that will incentivize people? And this goes with one of the 5 questions we had to start the session. If you remember, one of the very first 5 questions that y'all kind of posited as to why you're even here is incentives. Courts are really good at sanctions. That's what we do. Incentivizing takes a little bit more creativity. It also takes stepping outside of our box. Y'all have all heard about me. You all know I was a prosecutor 1,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago when dinosaurs roamed the earth, but it hasn't really changed being a prosecutor. And it did take a culture change for me to step out of that and think about, well, what would be meaningful incentives for folks? Verbal praise. We've seen this if you've, for those of you who've worked in drug courts, or for those of you who are new to drug courts, if you've visited one before, one of the things I think that is the most striking for anyone the very first time you visit a drug court is to see the judge tell someone, you've done a good job. Because that is something that we never see in any other court. It's just not the way court is structured. Court is typically not structured that someone reports to a judge so that the judge can kind of see how they've been doing, right? Typically when someone comes to court, it's because you've done something bad, and now you're in front of me and I'm the judge. And so I have to now make a determination. Well, in drug court, things are different, so I can give you praise. What we also know from the literature is that as human beings, we can become habituated to almost any kind of incentive, and that can be a frightening thing if you're someone who kind of relies on incentives. But the one incentive the literature seems to indicate we never become habituated to is being told that we're doing a good job. That is something that, this is not just people in drug court, this is as human beings. Human beings as a group, we will respond to you're doing a good job without ever becoming habituated to that. Applause too, is something, and another thing I like about these 2 things is that they're free. We talked about, and I mentioned this a little bit too when we had the panel during lunch. There are things that we hear about that courts are doing, and sometimes we hear, this court in Chicago is doing something. In Chicago, to me, I've been to the city, and it's a great city, but it's a whole different world from where I can wrap my mind around. But when you look at what's up here with incentives and sanctions, these are things that any court anywhere in the country can do. These are things that when I visited the court in Bethel, Alaska, and Bethel is in a county, and I think the county is like the size of Oregon, they do these things. It's stuff anyone can do. Tokens, giving some sort of token. For example, you can give a token for 90 days clean. Which I also, when I'm talking about tokens, is you can give something that's some sort of tangible thing that someone has that recognizes that they've done well. For example, worked with the court years ago, and I don't see much of this because this actually costed a money, but in this one court, for people who were involved in NA and AA, they got the folks the big book, and they had people in their group sign it. and that was one thing they did. It's not something I see repeated a lot, but again, it's something that was very tangible. Certificates are something that is free. Again, you could be anywhere in the country. When I was in Lexington, South Carolina, we had virtually no money, but I discovered that at Office Depot, they had, you could buy a whole box of certificate paper, where a certificate from that might cost 1/1000th of a penny for a piece of paper, and I could just print it off in my printer, and you give it to folks at basically no cost at all, and this is something that really motivates folks. So it's cost you nothing, and it motivates them. And if you ask yourself, which sometimes people will, well, why is this so motivating? Many of the people in your program have never received a certificate for anything they've done in their life. They've never gotten one. It's a complete novel experience for them. Gift certificates, there are some programs that use gift certificates, and I'm going to kind of quickly segue into the fishbowl drawings. Have y'all ever heard of fishbowl experiments, contingent management? If you have not, raise your hand. Oh, only one person, so I'm not going to go through that. If you're interested in the one person, email me and I'll send you the literature. It's fascinating, but basically what it means is that I can incentivize you, and incentives, when you look at the literature without going through what the fishbowl experiment was, the most powerful thing it shows, and this goes to the young lady's question about incentives, is that, and this actually goes to the gentleman's question behind you too, because this is probably the thing as for a prosecutor that was the most motivating for me in getting me to look at incentives rather than sanctions. In this piece of literature, incentives were more powerful. They were, as a matter of fact, if I remember one of the big studies on it, when they had the two different groups and they were both getting exactly the same treatment, but the one group got incentives, y'all had a 4 times greater success rate. And the only thing different was y'all were incentivized. That was the only thing different. You all had the same treatment, you all had the same background, you all had the same everything. It's amazing how, and this wasn't drug court, this was a treatment program, but again, it's amazing how as human beings, we respond to incentives. It's also, on the kind of the flip side of that, for a lot of, if you're working with, and y'all heard me talk about best practice standards yesterday, and y'all heard me talk about standard 1 being about targeting, and who's the target population in adult drug court should, they should do what? High risk, high need. If I'm a high risk, high need person in your criminal justice system, do you think about what qualifies as high risk? I started my first criminal behavior when I was younger than 16, my first drug use younger than 13, I have criminal associations, I can go on and on, right? I've probably been arrested more than one time. I've been in jail before. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday too. I asked y'all, kind of as a group, what would be other things I would present with? What would be the other problems? And what did y'all say? What are other issues, other than the fact that I'm now possibly in jail and I have a criminal record? What are other things I present with? Problems. Financial. So I don't have any money. I've never written a check. I don't have a checking account. I have no idea how to manage my financial life if I even have one. Somebody else. Housing. I have no stable place to live. Support systems. I don't have any of those. I don't have a job, and I haven't had one in years. And I'm not particularly employable. I don't necessarily have good transportation, etc. I mean, we can just go on, etc., etc. So you can see how giving me a sanction might not be as motivating as giving me an incentive. Because if you put yourself now, if you imagine that you yourself have all those problems, right? You're now in jail. But even if I let you out of jail tomorrow, you have no stable place to go, you have no family that will see you, all of your friends are involved in criminal activity and are using drugs, you don't have a job, you don't have any money, if you did, you don't know how to manage it, you don't have transportation, on and on. There's really not much a sanction can do to make your life a whole lot worse. So it's not surprising that sanctions aren't as motivating. It's hard for us, and I think that's one of the things. It's hard for me, from a justice system background, to wrap my mind around that, but the fact is, you take someone who's in that position, it's hard to sanction them anymore, they've already been sanctioned, right? So incentives actually can make a difference. Now, We can also reward them by, for example, if they've got a restriction like a curfew, making that curfew later, giving someone a little bit more latitude than they might have. Sometimes it's built into the program where the reduced court appearances, you've done really well. You're now in phase 2. You've been reporting every week, now you're going to report every 3 weeks. That gives you some more latitude, right? Some more latitude built in, some more freedom. If you have certain fees, some courts work on, you've done particularly well, we can waive those fees. So you're also giving an incentive in that way. For punishments, the opposite of the verbal praise is we can reprimand you. A judge can tell you how disappointed he is. We can give an earlier curfew. We can give community service. I've worked with drug courts over the years who have had, a lot of drug courts will actually tally and keep a running tally of how much community service their folks do. And that's not really necessarily for the folks in your program, but when you go to report to the community, you can talk about, the drug court participants have done this much community service. Sitting in the jury box is a fairly common, well, I assume it's still common. It was back in the day, sanction, and it had someone come to court and sit in the jury box. Maybe during the drug court session, or just, if someone in some large jurisdictions where drug courts kind of held a lot, or just on a regular court day. And just sit there, but also take notes, because you may, you're not just sitting there counting sheep or, counting the blots on the wall or whatever. You actually are taking notes so that you can write a report to the judge about what you learned about sitting in court. I have spent many, countless days in court and have never heard of a worse sanction. And having just come sit in court and then write a report on it. We talked about flash incarceration actually during the plenary yesterday. And again, short periods of incarceration. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more during the presentation. This goes to your comment, one of the first comments we started with about wrapping your mind around that. And the way, I always think back to a judge I worked with years ago, and what he told people was, and where he held drug court was in a room about this big, but he also had a courtroom that was like 10 times the size, with the big columns and stuff. And he would tell them, he would say, I'm in here to change your behavior. I have another courtroom where I can see you if I'm going to punish you, because I know how to punish you. And drug court was for motivated behavior, but punishment was something different. And so when we're looking at incarceration, and again, I talked about this, I guess it was in the lunch panel, we know that short periods of incarceration work better. There's been a lot of research done on this. As a matter of fact, when I talked about the best practice standards yesterday, there's that best practice standard on incentives and sanctions. And I remember I told y'all we only wrote a standard if it had that really high amount of research on it. Well, there's enough research on incentives and sanctions to have its own standard. And some of that research has actually looked at the period of time someone's in incarceration. And y'all heard me say after the lunch panel that after 6 days, you get negative effects. So that's motivating someone's behavior. And the fact is, when you look at the research a little bit deeper, no matter who we are, if any of us are sent to jail, as hard as it is to wrap your mind around, you will become acclimated to being in jail. If Martha Stewart did it and she had a $40 million house in the Hamptons, we will all become acclimated to being in jail. And what the research seems to show is that at a certain period of time you become acclimated to it. And kind of also, when you think about it, just from, at least from my experience, and y'all tell me if y'all's experience is different. From my experience working in the drug courts that I worked in, if folks were sent into detention for a weekend for a sanction, and again, this is the last sanction you want to use, because once you've gone to detention, you have no right, you can escalate from there, right? But once someone goes to jail, in my community at least, they go in and they're processed, and they go through the processing stage, and then they go into the population, and there might be, depending on the jurisdiction, and I worked in a couple of them, from a few dozen to a couple hundred people in the facility. And we work with high-risk, high-need. Working with high-risk, high-need folks in a small or relatively small community, what was the likelihood, if y'all send me to jail in your community, that I'm going to know someone behind the bars. Oh, it's almost 100%. So once I figure out who that person is in there, and then I figure out, is there somebody in there who I know, or I've known in the past, or I can talk to, or whatever, then that acclimation starts, right? And I don't know if this is the best comparison, but I like to make it. I've often thought about those holiday parties that when you're in a relationship or you're married that are just awful, the most horrible thing to go to at the end of the year, because you have to go to your wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, husband's company holiday party. And you are dreading it. And all you want to do is get out of it, but you know that you can't, and you go to it, and you don't want to be anywhere. There's nowhere else you want to be less than you want to be here, right? But what you start to see is like you start to see like the young man in the back, people who are just like you, where you're standing against the wall and you're like near the door. How can I possibly get out of here? And so you're like, well, maybe I'll go back there and talk to him because he looks like he's as miserable as I am. Well, now after that party, if there's also then what? A New Year's party following it that the company has, you're not quite so much thinking it's an awful thing. Because what's your name? Mike. So I'm thinking, Mike's probably going to be there. And he's going to hate it probably more than I'm going to hate it. So it's not going to be that bad. How different is it? If I know that Mike is going to be in jail, I think Mike's going to be in jail this weekend. Or maybe I can find Mike, or a dozen other Mikes that I know in the community. Well, it's going to take me a while after processing to figure out where Mike is. We're not having a party where it's like a room like this and Mike's standing there. When you go into custody, unless it's a teeny tiny jail, it takes a while, right? So I don't know if that's really the reality behind the science, but when I read the science and I think about the folks I dealt with who we were sending into custody, the longer they were in there, the more they got acclimated. They got their friends, they were lifting weights, they were doing things, they had their group, right? So what we've seen courts do is shorter bursts of incarceration are more meaningful. So I go in there, maybe the moment I actually find Mike and we're having a conversation, the buzzer goes off, Carson, you're out. And so then I'm out, and then I do something again, I'm going in the next weekend or 2 weekends later. So I'm not in there long enough for me to get acclimated to it. The other thing is that unless you've got amazing resources in your community, there is very, very few jails. I knew the percentage at one point in time, but very, very few jails who have the resources to have treatment in the house, right? It's very expensive to have evidence-based treatment behind the bars. So if you put somebody in jail for the weekend for a short period of time, then you can also get them out and they're right back into treatment. They're right back into treatment. They're right back into community supervision. If they have a job, they're keeping their job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that you're not upsetting where their progress should be. If they have a job, you're not accommodating them, but you're also trying to get that person to continue down the road. You want the ball to continue to move down the field. And I left the quick letter down somewhere in here. So, I'm sorry, I put past it. So, on the opposite of getting less fines, you can collect more fines. Points. Some programs actually judge progress on getting on a point system. And that's a whole separate conversation, but where certain things that you do, you actually accrue points. So, negative drug tests, reporting for treatment, reporting for this. And when you get to a certain point in time and you accrue a certain number of points, it actually is a trigger for going on to a next phase. So, having a reduction of points would be then, in that kind of a program, a sanction, right? So that would have to be a meaningful sanction. Now we have treatment responses. So how could the treatment then respond to something that I did if I'm in your drug court? Well, we're talking a whole different world. So think back to things in the lunch panel that Carolyn was talking about. For example, there's something that's happened, I'm not making it, treatment's not working for me. And you're going to have this happen in your drug court, I promise you. You're going to have people come into your drug court who are going to treatment. So I'm going to treatment. I am going to court. I'm doing everything I should do, but I'm using. And I'm telling my counselor I can't stop. Well, I might need a higher level of care, right? I'm trying, but I'm not getting there. So you may need to redo my assessment. We talk about trauma a lot. I know there's presentations at the conference on trauma. But again, it says add trauma groups, but behind that, what I'll basically, kind of as a catch-all, there are possibly issues that I'm not dealing with that no one's even discovered that I have because I haven't shared them. And one thing Carolyn mentioned in there was trauma assessments, not quite when you get in. I'm not surprised the research has said that. It's always kind of, I mean, I remember years ago as a prosecutor when I asked the treatment providers, 20 years ago who did our drug and alcohol treatment, I said, oh, y'all assess them, that's cool. Can I actually see those questions you're asking them? And they showed me. And I thought to myself, I would not answer these questions if my best friend asked me them. But these people are coming off the street and they're expected to get honest answers to someone they've never met about questions that are the most probing questions you could possibly imagine, and they're not supposed to bulkhead it at all. So I'm not surprised that trauma assessments are more effective later on. Treatment may decide to put them in more treatment. They may decide that they need additional meetings. They may need to move to a higher level of care. That might mean going to inpatient treatment. Inpatient treatment is a scarce resource. We do know from the research that folks will do, most folks will do just as well in intensive outpatient, but there are going to be circumstances where people may need to go to inpatient care. Then you can also, on the other end, you can backtrack on that. Once someone is then the three things on the right-hand side, now I'm doing better. And again, what goes with this, and we know from the risk-need literature, is you don't want to treat me outside of where my risk and my need are. You don't want to give me more treatment than I need, because it might surprise you. You could actually make me worse by over-treating me. You don't want me, if I'm low risk, to put me in the group of high-risk folks. And I don't know, again, if this is the best analogy, because I'm not a scientist and, muckety-muck, I'm just a lawyer working in the system. But what I've heard from folks and evaluators for years and years and years with our juvenile justice system is that you can take kids who have, gotten in trouble a couple times and put them into a juvenile detention facility, and they'll come out as career criminals. And what I hear from this research, from the research behind high risk, low risk, is if you put a low risk person, adult, into a high-risk group, you're almost guaranteed they're going to come out as high risk. But the opposite isn't true. If all of y'all are low risk and Mike is high risk and walks in here, he's not going to suddenly become low risk. So we have to be kind of careful about that, which, in a drug court, in a lot of jurisdictions, when you think about, and I'm very big on this piece too, which I don't know if this has been talked about at the conference at all, but I always talk to drug court folks about looking past drug crimes. And y'all might all already be doing this, but I still work with a lot of courts that aren't. But I was talking to a judge not long ago, something that I don't hear a lot of, and I'm hearing more and more of. In his particular jurisdiction, they don't take any drug crimes in. Because what was most impacting, what they determined was most needed in their community was to respond to property crimes that were being driven by drug use. And so, again, that's a kind of a different conversation to have, but it goes to the high-risk piece, because you can have, there's a lot of folks, it's kind of like the low-hanging fruit for drug courts are people arrested for drug crimes. I've been talking to jurisdictions for 2 decades, and you hear the statistics, but when you ask people about their local statistics, the number is always there. How many crimes in your jurisdiction involve alcohol and drug use? And it's always 60 to 85%. And drug crimes are a small portion of those. So what happens to these other folks? They're not all going to prison. I mean, there's no way, because prisons would be 10 times more than they are now. A lot of folks are staying in the community, and a lot of them have serious addiction problems, but they're not going in the drug court. Which, I don't know, I don't understand that, because you've got people who have serious addiction problems who not only maybe had drug crimes in their past, but now they're victimizing people by stealing your lawnmower out of your garage or your stereo out of your car or whatever, but they're on probation of remaining in the community, but they're not getting the supervision that drug court provides, which is, in almost every jurisdiction I've been in, much more than probation gives. That's a side note. This one, not kind of good. So, I talked about certainty. We have to be reliable. Reliable detection, oftentimes when people teach this, they'll talk about drug tests. And this actually came up. The judge in the panel before here, or you can see him here, I don't see him. Great example about the gentleman being sent to detention, but then he had a confirmation test come back, and he was actually not positive. So being sure that it's reliable. It's not just drug tests, though. I've worked with a bunch of courts that have curfews, and I've asked them, are you sure the way you check on curfews is reliable? Are you sure that was it just John thinks he saw Bob out at a bar at 11:30, or is it more reliable than that? Be certain that the incentive or sanction is associated with the behavior. And the research that says that the more immediate it can be, the better. And that's one thing that a lot of this research was around 20 years ago, 27 years ago when drug court started. One reason why we have immediacy as such a key element in drug courts is because we've known this all along. Immediacy is so critical. If you look at the research, it's very clear to any of us as people. If I am going to sanction you for something and I want it to have better impact, I need to sanction you closer to the event when you did something than farther away. If you do something today and I don't sanction you for it until July the 19th, January the 19th, it has less impact. That's one of the big ways that drug court is different from standard probation. In a lot of places, if I'm on probation and I do something that could potentially get me revoked, by the time that, maybe the first violation won't get a violation of probation filed, but maybe a VOP is filed a third time. And by the time that hearing is scheduled, it could be 4, 5, 6 months later. So there's 4 or 5 or 6 months between this infraction and my seeing a judge. Well, in drug court, immediacy is there because there's not that period of time. There's immediacy involved. One thing that drug courts sometimes do with that piece, though, is they figure, well, we already have these immediate hearings kind of built into our program, right? Where I'm seeing every week, or every other week, or every third week. But one thing that we've seen drug courts do that are creative, that a lot of courts can do, well, let's say that you are having dockets every other week, and I'm in the third phase, and I've done something, and I'm normally appearing every fourth week. Well, you can bring me in early. You can say, well, Carson missed the drug screen. We're not going to wait for 2 more weeks. He has to come in this week because he missed the drug screen. So you're giving more of an immediate sanction, even though my normal court date wouldn't be for 2 weeks. You bring me in with the phase 1 group, not with the phase 2 group. So I talked about there's a standard. I'm not going to belabor that. I hope that I mentioned to y'all. You can go to the website that Carolyn mentioned. You can also just go to nadcp.org and get the standard. The standards you can just download. And again, I've done this before, and I won't. I mean, y'all know how to use the computer. I'm not going to go through it for y'all. But literally, if you go to allrise.org, the NADCP homepage comes up. There's usually something on the homepage that says standards, where you can just click on the NDCI link and it'll say publications, and you can click on standards. 25 seconds, you can download it. It's right there. And I mentioned to y'all yesterday, if you haven't read the Incidents and Sanctions Standard, you could sit down over lunch and read the whole thing. It's not, they were designed to be easily digestible. The things that are talked about in the standard, and I think I mentioned to y'all yesterday that if you opened one up, that they would have the title, the black letter, and the bullets. And that's generally on the first page. And it's so short it generally doesn't even take up the whole page. But what you'll find there is advance notice, an opportunity to be heard. That's one thing that's critical that I think sometimes we overlook. I'm going to talk about that more in my session next, too, about in due process. But if I've done something that I'm going to be sanctioned for, the judge ought to ask me about it in court, right? I mean, I need to be able to have my input. Well, just think about the young man the judge talked about after lunch, who I'm sure would have said, had he had the opportunity, if he wasn't immediately incarcerated, would have said, Judge, I didn't use. You need to review the test I didn't use. It doesn't mean that someone won't lie to you, but also having the opportunity to be heard. We talked about fairness, equivalent consequences. Mike and I are in the program. We both entered exactly the same time. We both have basically the same issues and all that stuff. 10 days later, we both are out together, we use, and y'all find out, no difference. He doesn't admit, I don't admit, he gets a different sanction than I get. That goes into the perception of unfairness. And I will tell you, having worked with programs for a lot of years, once you get that perception of unfairness in your program, it's a hard thing to claw back from. Because, and this is another thing that's kind of, it's interesting but also kind of scary from the research, that, and this doesn't go to just folks in the justice system, this is all of us. Oddly enough, or maybe not oddly, if we perceive that we are being treated unfairly, we actually can do something that seems counterintuitive. We will lash out at authority, even if we know intellectually that by lashing out, it will negatively affect us. Does that make sense? I mean, and again, this anecdote might not be the best description, but the first time I heard that, it popped in my mind when I was a kid. I was interning somewhere, and I was at the water cooler in this office, and people were talking about their performance evaluations. And one person was saying, well, you know, I had a bad performance evaluation, and I think I'm a pretty good employee. Just wait till next time, and they'll see what a bad employee is. And I was thinking to myself, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But again, if you think you're being treated unfairly, we will act out. So, of course, folks in drug court could act out. So fairness is something that, if it's not built in, you can actually have, you know, what is it, the actogenic effects. Yes, ma'am?
We have, in our drug court, we have 5 phases. And some of the participants believe that they're being treated unfairly because they're in different phases, so the sanctions are different in different phases.
Right.
So you may go to jail, but you won't the same behavior because you're in phase 1 and you're in phase 5. So if that does happen and someone says, well, I don't think that's fair, he can go to jail, do you address that in court? Do you say this is why you're doing this?
What I've seen happen that is very powerful is, and I've had folks ask this question, that oftentimes it's the judge. And the judge can even have that open colloquy with the person and say, so Mike, you tested positive, but you know, looking here at 24 hours in jail, and Carson tested positive. Is there anything different that Carson did that you didn't do? And Mike might say, well, because Carson just got sanctioned, right? And Mike's like, well, Carson admitted to it. Yeah, and when did he admit to it? Well, he called his sponsor that night. And he called his case manager. I'm just using the story that Phil used. He calls his case manager by morning. And then what did he do? And kind of talking through so that he expresses that. And so if it's a phase difference, it could be, well, you know, he's been in the program longer, whatever it might be, having someone articulate that so that they're foretelling it. And I've heard that come, and I don't know that there's research behind that. I think it's a very difficult thing to research, but what I've heard anecdotally is that gets everybody to see that this is fair, that there's actually differences between folks. And then kind of on the flip side of that, if Mike can't articulate that, if there are no differences between Carson and Mike, then that's something for the court to look at, right? If there's nothing for him to articulate, if there is no difference, then now if Mike doesn't want to volunteer, then the judge can prompt him. Well, you know, didn't Carson admit to it? Those kinds of things, right? And have that so that everyone can see that it's fair. Because, and I agree, if you don't help folks paint the picture, they won't see it. And that's not just folks in drug court, that's a lot of folks. I mean, you know, I want to say my siblings don't think things are fair in my family. And I'm like, please people, you're all in your 40s. But, you know, my mother has to explain it to us. So I think explaining things to people often helps, and letting them explain it can help. But I don't know. I hope one day we'll have research that's sophisticated enough to actually drill down and tell us the magic thing to do there. Yes, sir.
Oh, so, and obviously, I'm not talking about a severe possibility of sanction. I understand that it's noticed that you've missed 2 meetings. You're supposed to be with 2 meetings next week. Why do we have to give advance notice in relation to that sanction?
Okay.
Because the colloquy to the judges, so do you want to tell me something about that? He says, well, I didn't get to any of my A meetings this
right.
week. And there's a discussion, so, and we're going to give the sanction in relation to that. So define the word advance notice.
I may have mentioned this, and I apologize to y'all if I keep saying I might have or I might have said this. I'm literally on the road every week, so please give me a little bit of latitude because I'm talking to people every week. But I think I may have talked about yesterday, or maybe it was after lunch, where one thing that I've seen in courts that is tremendously powerful is no matter what the response is going to be, if it's a negative response, having after staffing, there be a window of time where the defense attorney can talk to me. So in that situation, the advance notice would be the defense attorney is going to, the attorney on the team will come to me and say, hey Carson, what's up with this in the meetings? Well, it was busy, I forgot where the bus picked up or whatever it was. You do know that the court's going to have a response to that. So if your excuse is where you forgot where the bus picked up and you've been in the program for 7 months, if your mom died, or if you got whatever, you were in the hospital or whatever, okay, well, do you have that? Do you have that information? Because the court's going to ask for that. So having that opportunity so it's not sprung on somebody, and that's something that we've seen just through technical assistance. It makes the program, I think, just fairer in general, right? Because, it goes to not wanting to spring things on people, but it also gives that person that opportunity. And, honestly, I would think they should know that, but it goes to not being prepared in general, which a lot of folks won't be, right? They're not going to be as prepared as you or I might be in the program. We want to get them there. But having that opportunity for their attorney to say, hey, what's up with this? You're going to be asked about it. There's going to be a response. You understand this is a requirement in the program. You saw this last week, and Mike was sanctioned for this. So what's up there? And it gives them the opportunity to have that. And in that way, too, there's an understanding there. And if I'm representing them, I would want to know as their attorney, before I'm standing in court with the team, that their mom died. Because I might not know. Now, they should have called me and told me. That would make the most sense. But we all know from having worked in the system, sometimes it doesn't make the most sense what happens, right? And so that's a big piece of it there, just so that they know, so that you can be prepared. Another thing, too, is that if you're the judge, you don't want to be taken off guard with that, too. So you'd like to have that information. Hopefully you'd have it ahead of time. Let's see if there's another one. Professional demeanor just basically means, and this is actually also referenced in the judicial standard, and this is so that the judge doesn't talk in a negative way, talk down to people, because in the research that can have a bad effect. If people feel like they're being minimized, and actually that goes back again to the National Center for State Courts evaluation way back in the 80s, which is one of the things. We talked about progressive sanctions. It talks about intoxicating substance, illicit, addictive, or intoxicating substances. The standard also talks about therapeutic adjustments, which we've talked about already. You want to incentivize productivity, phase promotion. I talked about that. Phase promotion is one thing I'll spend a couple minutes on. I've seen drug courts do this in, I mentioned to y'all AA books and A books. That's kind of an expensive thing. I mentioned to you the certificates. One thing down a little bit farther that's related to that is graduations. I've seen drug courts make a big deal about graduations. Again, a lot of these folks may never have graduated from anything. A lot of the folks in your program, you may find, don't have a high school diploma. So they've never had the graduation from something. A powerful motivating force that I've seen there is, Mike was my arresting officer, invite Mike to my graduation. And I've seen arresting officers that literally it changed their minds about drug court, because they came to, like Mike came to my graduation. He's arrested me, let's say 8 times in my life. In the community, he knows me. He's like, Carson, how's it going, whatever. When I'm out of jail, he's like, Carson, you doing all right, whatever, right? He knows me. So he arrested me, how long ago? 19 months ago. And he arrested me, he called Scott, who's the DA. He's like, hey, arrested Carson. I know you know Carson, and he's been around for a while. I know you got this new drug court, probably a good candidate. I don't know if anybody's got a worse drug problem than him, and then that's it. But what I've seen in a lot of drug courts is that 19 months later, when Carson graduates, the arresting officer is invited, and then that also can get the law enforcement community more involved. And I've actually seen this, I saw this in my drug court, but I've seen it in other drug courts, where the arresting officer does not even recognize the person. Because Mike's arrested me so many times over maybe a 12-year period, but he hasn't seen me. If I've been doing well in drug court, he hasn't seen me in the last 19 months. Because I'm not in those places. I shouldn't be, right? I'm not doing those things. And when he sees me, I'm healthier. I'm different looking. I don't know if y'all have ever been to our conference or seen like the before and after shots. You don't recognize people. They look completely different. I mean, there's a lot of conversation in this country now about and the opioid epidemic. But in Montana, y'all are dealing with methamphetamine. Methamphetamine physically changes the way you look. I don't have to tell y'all that. And when you see the graduation pictures from the pictures when people were booked in, these are different people. And that can be very motivating too. And that's not just for the participant, that's for the people in the program and for the community. Termination is addressed, termination being the greatest sanction that you can give. We talked a little bit about that in the panel afterwards. And someone, I didn't say anything because someone basically said the answer I would say. When you want to keep somebody as long as you can. A lot of the folks you have in your program, because they're high risk, high need, by definition too, if they're high risk, high need, keep in mind, they may have been in treatment programs before and failed out. That's not a reason not to take them. That is one of the characteristics that makes them high risk, right? It takes a long time sometimes for someone to recover. I think about people in my life who have just tried to stop smoking and how many times they tried to quit before they could, even though they knew that, even if it was negatively affecting their life. We talked about advance notice. When we talk about all these things, one of the things, and this goes to your question, was having, just in the very beginning, advance notice as my attorney, I'm coming into drug court. Okay, you're coming into drug court. We have this pamphlet that describes drug court. You do understand that coming into drug court, if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So at the very beginning, there's also advance notice. And I know I talked about that kind of at the beginning of the presentation. People need to know in general in drug court what they're getting into. I need to be able to make an informed decision as to whether or not I want to come into drug court. If I'm pleading into it or whatever it is, what is it? What is drug court? Because it's a, if you don't know otherwise, it's kind of a black box. Think about the first time you heard of drug court and how you were like, what is that? There's no reason why someone who pleads into it without a description of it would know anything else about more about what drug court is. We talked about the opportunity. I've already talked about all these, so I'm just going to scroll through. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to go back to this one because this is brought up after the lunch discussion. Participants are not shamed. What Phil mentioned happened in the court in Miami. That's one of the things, I haven't heard that in a long time. So, but when I teach about federal confidentiality laws, one of the things I always teach as an aside is even if you have a release to get information about making a treatment provider, doesn't mean that it's necessary to talk about it in open court. Oh, person, I hear that, you're doing so well, even considered that you were sexually molested by your uncle for 11 years. You look great. Now, and I'll tell y'all, I've been in courts where there was a graduation, this wasn't that long ago, and something happened, and it wasn't the judge, it was someone else in court who spoke at the graduation, and I don't think people in the court thought this person was going to say that. But they more or less said something like, well, I think Carson's doing phenomenally well, given that he was just such a hot mess 18 months ago. And kind of went into detail, which is not at all what you could tell because that was one of the person who said. Having progressive sanctions, we've talked about that. You have to have somewhere to go. Oh, I hate going back. And I can't stand these slide transitions. Do y'all like those? Or do y'all like this normal transition? I always feel like I don't know. You need to have proximal and distal goals. So, and Carolyn mentioned this a little bit, and I know that a lot of y'all have heard this umpteen times, but for those of you who haven't, when I first, I'm just going to kind of dumb it down to where I can understand it. Proximal goals for me are things that I can reasonably do now, right? So Carolyn talked about Dennis as her drugging buddy. Again, I learn something new every day, and I learn that. So a proximal goal for her would be she can stay away from Dennis, right? So proximal things are things that you can do now. Distal things are that you really can't do until later. And so you don't want to sanction be the same for something that I can't reasonably do until later. You have someone come into your program, they've been using meth for 17 years, they live under a bridge, they have no family or community connections, et cetera, et cetera. There are going to be things let's say that's me, right? There are going to be things you want me to achieve before I graduate. And I'm going to graduate in 18 months. But you'll all know there's some things that on that list of things I'm not going to be able to do next week or even next month. I'm going to have to get there before I can do them. So you're not going to want to sanction me for not being able to do them when I can't do them now. And so it's what you expect from me now versus what you can reasonably expect from me later. You're really loud. Is it them or through that door? Is that Phil?
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. That's better. Maybe not. So moderate sanctions are better. I love this. Y'all heard about the boiling frog? Okay, everybody's heard the boiling frog, and I swear to you, I had not heard the boiling frog until I heard this presentation given the first time like 18 years ago. I was like, really? That's fascinating. So for those of you who haven't, you put a frog into, I drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, and that frog will jump out. I'm sure it will say ouch or some other frog expletive, and then it will jump out of the water. But if you put the frog in a pot of cool water and you slowly heat it up, the frog won't be able to tell, and it will burn to death. Interesting to know. I had never heard that before until 18 years ago, but apparently everybody else in the world knows it. So if you give someone, the whole idea there is, if you give me low sanctions over and over again, I will become habituated to low sanctions. So you don't want to continue to say, no Carson, no Carson, no Carson, 2 hours of community service, 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 that over and over again. You want to be able to go up, right? You want to have progressive sanctions. So again, you have to have somewhere to go. You don't want to immediately hit your ceiling, because once you hit your ceiling, you, by definition, don't have anywhere to go. And we know people will become acclimated to things, so you hit your ceiling, now you're kind of done. And you know ahead of time, if you have high-risk, high-need people, if you've got people on methamphetamine who have been on it for a long time and they've already lost everything else, sanctioning them to change is probably not going to when you think about how horrible their life might be now, right? We're probably not going to be able to create something in a sanction that's going to beat that. So we're working with everything else. We talked about this. So proximal things I can do is I can go to group and I can go to court. I can go to case management. I can attend things that you want me to go to. Showing up. Showing up is a proximal behavior. I can tell the truth. If you ask me something, I can tell the truth. I can tell you, yes, I was there. Yes, I did that. Yes, that was my drug test. I can make an attempt. I can make an attempt to do better. Those are things that, for the high-risk, high-need population that you're dealing with when they first come into the program, those are all proximal things. Those are things that you can reasonably expect someone to be able to do. What might be difficult for them is to abstain. So years ago, when I first started in the drug court world, and was kind of finding my way, there was a treatment provider who explained it the best way I've ever heard it. He said, if someone comes into your drug court and they can stop using drugs because you ask them to, they don't have a substance use disorder. Or at that point in time, the literature was addicted. They're not addicted. If you just ask them, if I say, Mike, stop using, he's like, okay, I'm good. And he just stops using, he doesn't need to be in drug court. I mean, think about it. If he was able to say, oh, okay, that's what you were asking me to do all along. Okay, well, I'm not going to use anymore. That's not who you're looking for to begin with. I mean, I've certainly been to drug court graduations where there were 6 people who graduated and they said that none of them ever tested positive. And I was curious about that. But you're usually completely abstaining is a distal goal. Like Carolyn talked about a long time, so I'm not going to rehash what she said. It doesn't mean you don't respond, right? But it also means that we know, and we hear relapse as a part of recovery. But another thing that we have to keep in mind is if I come into your drug court tomorrow and what is today, Thursday, and I test positive on Monday, I haven't relapsed. I never stopped using. So relapsing is there's a period of where I stop using, and then something happened, and then I didn't use the tools I had, and I used again. When people first come into your drug court and they test positive, they're continuing to use. Accepting where I am could be distal as well, and then adhering to everything that I'm supposed to adhere to a long time could also be distal. So things that you want to ask yourself is, who are they in terms of risk and need? Well, they should be high risk and they should be high need if they're in adult drug court. Now, if you're looking at other types of problem-solving courts, that might be different, depending on the literature. For example, if you have a juvenile drug court folks, raise your hand. I won't talk about that. Oh, so one. So in the juvenile drug court, just a quick synopsis. If the average length of addiction for an adult in adult drug court is 15 years, which is that's a number I've heard, and the average age of someone in a juvenile drug court is 15 years old, there's obviously going to be a difference. Also in juvenile drug courts, incentives can be very powerful. I will use the opportunity in talking about juvenile drug courts because this story will apply to you, it will apply to everybody else in this room. We've talked about incentives, and this is one of the questions we had about how powerful incentives are or can be, right? And and by the way, going to your question with the judge, I'm hoping everything we've talked about, like the verbal, all that goes straight from the bench. I mean, most, if not all, we've talked about should be judicially driven after working with the team. True story, worked with drug court, juvenile drug court, and it wasn't in Montana, but it was in a state like Montana, meaning that it was beautiful with mountains and horses and, just whatever, picturesque. And they had a juvenile drug court, and what they were doing, they were using as a sanction was, when the youth in the program did a certain infraction, and I cannot remember what the infraction was, it's not important, they would have to go to whatever the facility was on the outskirts of town where all the law enforcement kept the horses for law enforcement, and they would have to brush down the horses and clean out the stalls and all that, and that was their sanction. And y'all can guess where this is going. So pretty soon what was happening? They were all doing whatever that infraction was so they could go spend time with the horses. Because the people putting together the sanctions thought this would be the worst way to spend the weekend. I can't imagine people going to clean out stalls and brush down horses, and the kids were like, that is magnificent. That is exactly what I want to be doing. The same thing that I've seen with us working with adults in adult drug courts. I mean, I worked with a jurisdiction one time, and they admitted, just like this jurisdiction admitted, they were like, one of our biggest incentives is we give 2 tickets to the local baseball team's games. Everybody on the team was a huge baseball fan. It didn't occur to them until 2 or 3 years later to ask folks in the program. Almost nobody in their program cared about baseball for whatever reason. But again, it was... Anyway, I say that story. What I've heard of the juveniles oftentimes is, and this it also applies to adults. With kids, you want to find out what motivates them, right? It's no different from adults. We can't look at their lives through our lens. What will be an incentive for folks in our program, we might not even think of as an incentive, and vice versa. Where are they in the program? We've talked about that. Which behaviors are we responding to? We've already talked about proximal and distal. We've already talked about, is the magnitude correct? And then we talked about, to her question there, are you explaining that response? Are you following up and explaining it? Are you giving them the opportunity so that everyone can see the fairness? I thought I saw a hand. Okay. I know I'm almost running out of time. We've already talked about that. Actually, let me go back to that again in case I wasn't clear. So, 4 things that I can do now. Those things that y'all can reasonably expect me to do, the sanction y'all can give would naturally be greater. Because if I can do them, and I'm just choosing not to do them, that's what I'm telling you. I just choose not to do that. I'm sorry, you're in a court program. If you want to continue to participate, you have to do it. This is your sanction, which is a greater sanction than those things that are distal, that I can't be expected to do. We talked about that. We talked about that. I mean, I talked about that kind of throughout, so I hope that's kind of built into it. But again, moving the ball down the field, you want to incentivize my behavior, and I talk about how powerful incentives are. And this goes kind of basically to Mike's question, but also a couple of the other ones. After reading all this literature, the biggest epiphany for me was as a prosecutor in the jurisdiction where I was working, if I could go back to do the drug court tomorrow and someone told me, hey Carson, you got to go back, you got to run this drug court, you're still dealing with high risk, high need folks, but you're not able to do incentives and sanctions. You really can only do one. I would have to pick incentives because the people I had worked with had been sanctioned in so many ways. They didn't have driver's licenses or jobs or places to live or anything else. Incentives would be the only thing I could even imagine after reading the literature would motivate them to do anything. And that to me, I think, was the biggest epiphany that I had, that might be the only thing that might motivate them to just, frankly, if I was in the situation that they were in, even jail, when you think about it, if Mike and I are buddies in jail because we're high risk, high needs, and we've been arrested, let's say 8 times in the past, let's say 16 times in the past, right? I know the jail. As soon as I come out of processing, I know where everything is. I know where the weight room is. I know where everything is. It's not an unfamiliar territory to me at all. So it's not necessarily, it's not something that is necessarily a sanction. There will be people in programs that it's a major motivating factor for, but a lot of the folks that you might be working with, they know the jail, the inside of the jail, as well as anybody who works inside the jail. And so going to jail might not be the most motivating thing. Doing community service might be much more motivating. Having to actually, get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and report to the community service side at 9 o'clock and do community service during the day. So typically lasting no more than 3 to 5 days. I think I mentioned to y'all in the literature, it says 6 is the outside high, 3 to 5, less is better. Definite duration also probably appears on this because it's a due process issue. And certainly I've seen some courts that have been placing people in for indefinite periods. There's no cap, and that's obviously a due process violation. And I say obviously because in those times it's happened, the appellate courts have not been friendly. And then terminations, they repeatedly failed to comply. This person is, now you've gotten to the point where someone is, if what you've got in a drug court is, you've got people who are concerned with public safety, right? And then you've got people who are concerned with me if I'm their client. So if one of those concerns, or there's an agreement with one of those, I'm not going to make it, this is not going to be any good for me, right? Meaning that I'm a public safety risk, or as a person, I'm done or whatever. That's when you kind of reach the end. There are people you will be banging your head against the table. I bang my head against the table. Some of them you won't wait 6 months. It'll be like the first week you'll be banging your head against the table. But we're not kicking people out because we're frustrated. Because they will frustrate you. That's what will happen. They will frustrate you. Mike, you're just starting. You will be like, what are we doing? Because you will ask people to do things. I'm sorry, and I have to remind myself. We're the court. We don't ask you. It's not a suggestion. You will tell people to do things. They won't do them. You will get frustrated. We're used to. You don't comply. You're gone. These are people typically who have a long history of not complying. And so if we want them to get better, we have to keep them in the program as long as we can. There are benefits for graduating. Carrots, we want to give people benefits. The benefit might be front-loaded or back-loaded. I think y'all know all this. And Mike in the drug court, they'll have that too. There'll be some benefit for me, whether it's on the front end or whether it's on the back end. And you can find, this goes to one of the questions, I think maybe one of the ones I didn't answer was, if you're looking for kind of an exhaustive list of what possible incentives and sanctions there are, go on the website. We can't attest that all the incentives and sanctions on the website definitely work, that they're all evidence-based, that they're all great. But what it is we hold courts all across the country. And there's an exhaustive list that you can kind of look at and see how creative folks are, and look at all the different incentives courts are using all over the country. All the different sanctions they're using all over the country. So that you're not just, and this did go to one of the questions, we're not just looking at jail. we're not just looking at sanctions, because the list on that website of incentives is pretty extensive of what courts are able to do. But I always come back to this at the end. Keep in mind, when I worked in the court, we had very little resources, and I always remember that you don't have to be able to have a fishbowl drawing or a color television set as one of the things somebody can win, you know? Remember, the one thing that no one's ever going to get tired of is being told they're doing a good job. That if that's what you can get, or those certificates that are virtually free, right? Those are things that are free, are easy, but will have a tremendous impact on people. And incentives are such a powerful thing. When you look at the courts that have done well, the research will show that if you're in my drug court and I sanction you, you will comply while I'm, and this is any program, you'll comply while you're there. Think of it as if you're on the floor and I've got my foot on your neck. Anything I tell you to do, you'll do it if I'm sanctioning you, right? But as soon as I take my foot off your neck and I step away and you can go, what the research shows, I've done nothing to change your long-term behavior. While you were in that program, you followed the rules, but I haven't motivated you to change your behavior. What the research shows is when I use those sanctions, but I combine them with incentives, I then actually motivated you to make changes so that you're different when you get out, so that then you don't come back into the justice system, which is why we have the programs to begin with. I think I'm out of time, so thank y'all so much. Enjoyed the conference, and I'll see maybe some of you in the next session, for those of you who are not sick and tired of hearing me.